טוב, כמו שכבר אמרתי קודם, שני המאמרים שהזכרנו מאוד מומלצים. יש בהם המון חוכמת סייבר. אוקיי, עכשיו אנחנו הולכים לחלק האקדמי יותר של המושב הזה. הדוברת הבאה היא פרופסור קתרין לוריאנטה, מנהלת המחלקה למשפט, מדע וביטחון לאומי וחברה בצוות האקדמי לנושאי ממשל, מדיניות חוץ באוניברסיטת ג'ורג'טאון, מלמדת קורסים על נושאי משפט במגוון תחומים, ביטחון לאומי, סייבר, מודיעין ויחסים בינלאומיים. בנוסף להיותה מרצה, היא יוזמת ומארגנת מחקרים ואירועים בנושאי עיסוקה תחת המחלקה למשפט, מדע וביטחון באוניברסיטת ג'ורג'טאון. בשנים 2002 עד 2006 כיהנה כיועצת לנשיא במסגרת הוועדה המייעצת לענייני מודיעין זר בבית הלבן. בנוסף כיהנה כיועצת משפטית למוסדות ממשל שונים, לנושאי מודיעין זר, לוחמת מידע וכו'. קייטרין קיבלה את הדוקטורט שלה באוניברסיטת ג'ורג'טאון, כתבה מאמרים וספרים רבים, והינה דוברת מבוקשת בכנסים באקדמיה, בצבא ובממשל. היא למעשה לייף ממבר במועצה ליחסים בינלאומיים. פרופסור קתרין, בבקשה.
Boker Tov. Thank you for remaining here. It's been a long day. I want to thank the organizers, Gilly, and say thank you to my friend, Yossi Shane, who has stayed into the long afternoon. Professor Shane actually is an example of the U.S. and Israel, or two universities sharing, actually. We share his time, and unfortunately we get very sad when he leaves and comes back to the University of Tel Aviv, but we remain happy when we await his return. So, but thank you, and thank you for allowing me to have my first visit to Israel. I wanted, before I speak to you about law, which hopefully is not too boring at this point in time in the day, I wanted to just give you a little background on my foray into cybersecurity and actually, coincidentally, the Israeli world, if you will, or culture. It was about 16 years ago that I began my work, I should say, in cybersecurity. I had started a job in 1996 at CIA's General Counsel's Office, and I was a lawyer for the operational work there. And in 2007, I was handed an account then called the Information Warfare Account. Now, the U.S., like other states, we've changed the terminology. We no longer refer to it as information warfare, IW. But then it was called information warfare. And soon after I started that job, I found myself in the Defense Information Systems Agency, DISA, at the Pentagon, and in their Security Operations Center. Because at the time, we were experiencing a cyber incident, and that DoD's systems had been hacked into. The incident was later given the name of Solar Sunrise. I don't know if some of you remember incidents that were back in the late 90s, but that was my first experience with how one investigates, actually, a cyber incident. At the time in DISA, there was a young Air Force captain who was working at DISA, and with a group of us in the SOC, I came to know him and thought he was pretty smart. He happened to have been of Israeli descent. At the same time, I was also taking a class at Georgetown called Information Warfare, getting my master's from Professor Dorothy Denning, who was teaching at the time the Information Warfare class. And I noticed that the same Air Force captain was in that class. But I did notice that Professor Denning was very deferential to him. In fact, asked him to speak and lecture in the class, and I noticed that he often didn't show up to class. And I found that quite unnerving, as he ultimately received an A in the class, as well as I did, but I pointed out to him that he hardly showed up to class, and I was wondering how he got an A. Anyway, about 5 or so years later, he ended up becoming my husband. And his world was cybersecurity in the technical sense. Some of you may know him as Amit Uran. He went on to, he's a brilliant businessman and cybersecurity expert. But our worlds began to collide, if you will. Me in the intelligence world, him soon to be in the corporate world, but I have to say, this experience of mine the last 10 years, my entrance into the Israeli culture, marrying into an Israeli family, I'm not quite sure which is more difficult to navigate. Cybersecurity or learning the wonders and the differences in the Israeli culture. But I have to say, there is no equivalent of cyber hell in learning the Israeli culture. It's a lot about passion and love. The passion I have for what I've learned through marrying into a very smart and passionate Israeli family also is the same passion that I have and I continue to learn and study in the cybersecurity aspect. As a trained lawyer, most of my focus has been on international law, and so I left the government in 2006 and started teaching full-time at Georgetown. And I want to speak to you, and I'll make it, I don't use slides, which is you're probably happy right at this point of the day, but I want to talk to you a little bit about international law and international norms in the cybersecurity field. And so to begin with, I think of, I guess, the global approach to international cybersecurity based on 6, I think, very important principles. And I've, advised the U.S. government on these principles, but actually they're appropriate for all nation states as we deal with the cybersecurity issues. So I'll go through those quickly and then get into some of the kind of the legal nuts and bolts, if you will. First, and they'll actually trail with a lot of what you heard about today from a number of different speakers. But the first principle I discuss is that cyberspace is not a unique environment. I sometimes think we forget that it is not some special domain, although it might be man-made. I believe that, like the other domains, that states will operate as they always have in this cyber domain, in this environment, which means that there will be conflict as well as opportunities for negotiation and agreement in this environment. The second principle is that, and I feel quite strongly about this, and this is contrary to what some have spoken about today and lots have written about over the years, is that we cannot disarm in cyberspace. In other words, there is no equivalent of a global zero for a cyber attack. Now, we may be able to, and this is what I've worked predominantly the last 5 years, spent most of my time on developing some of the rules of the road that states may agree to. But disarming in cyberspace is really not an option. In fact, the discussion on arms control and treaties dealing with arms control, I believe it's a correct idea, but the incorrect model to use. In other words, in cyberspace, we are not talking about certain specific weapons that we would outlaw, such as with the chemical and biological weapons and the nuclear weapons. Here it is a space, and in that environment, as principle number 1, I emphasize, that environment, like the other environments, states will continue to act as they do in other places. The third principle is that we've entered into a period of what I have thought of and described as sustained low-level competition for influence, where the opponents, states, will have and do have miscalculations and misperceptions, which are a source of risk for all of the nation states. So the importance about this is that because there is such a high risk of misperceptions and miscalculations, that a model of strategic ambiguity, I would argue, is very counterproductive to stability when we talk about cybersecurity. And therefore, coming to agreements on specific rules and expectations of how states are to behave in this environment is very important. The fourth principle, we are all nations are better served by embedding the topics and the issues of cyber attack and economic cyber espionage in the already existing international legal framework and into international legal agreements that we might come to form. That we don't need, in other words, a special new framework in which to work in. The fifth principle, and this is related to an immediate goal. What should be one of our immediate goals? I strongly believe that an immediate goal should be to increase the risk of launching a cyber attack or engaging in malicious cyber activities for both states and non-state opponents. So only by increasing the risks and the penalties and consequences might we get stability in the space. The sixth principle, there are limits to negotiations in cybersecurity to decrease risk, and I realize that. There will always be risks. The goal, though, is to decrease and bound that risk as part of larger efforts to strengthen international security. So much of what I teach and write about is based in some way related to one and all of these 6 principles. I believe that the key to all of this is developing international norms. The international norms are a very important part of the framework, but alone they're insufficient if they're not backed up by action. So states must be prepared, and one of the things that I most recently have written about and advocated for, states must be prepared to put on the table what their red lines and thresholds are in cybersecurity and actions between states. Some have argued that declaring red lines is dangerous, because once declaring them, our adversaries will push the limit and may cross those red lines, and therefore we must be prepared to act in response to when that happens. I respond and say that that always has been the case in international relations and international security, and yet, historically, red lines have benefited us. So developing these norms, but coupled with action by states, is very important. An example, so some of my students and others, when I write about international law and why it's so important to come to some agreement about the laws that are relevant in cyberspace, I often get asked of why we need such a consensus. And here are the words that I often throw back at folks that question whether this is important to have some of these rules. Misunderstanding, miscommunication, miscalculation based on misperception, an overestimation of the benefits of such things as cyber attacks by the opponents, and an underestimation of the cost involved in such action. So there are a lot of dangers with respect to tripping over red lines that states might not be cognizant of. This leads to greater instability and escalation and conflict in the cyber domain. The U.S. has taken a very pragmatic approach, I believe, and has sought for what has been considered a middle ground, seeking collaboration, often in bilateral efforts, but through confidence-building measures. These are mainly focused on transparency between states and also a discussion of possible red lines, of what thresholds we will begin to define that action that we accept in cyberspace and those actions that are not acceptable. So let me just talk quickly. I'll mention some of the thresholds and red lines, and then I'll get into some of the more nitty-gritty, as I would call, or in the weeds, on the laws itself under international law and conflict. So some of the thresholds that are worth thinking about, and some of the red lines worth drawing. We've heard a lot about crime, cybercrime, and espionage today. But there must be a distinction within the laws and in practice of states between what is cybercrime and espionage and that which causes damage and destruction. There's also another line that one can draw in distinctions when drafting up thresholds and red lines between damage and destruction of military targets versus damage and destruction of civilian critical infrastructure. And that is one that great effort is being done with respect to how one might be able to draw distinctions, and states might actually be able to incorporate those distinctions into their military operations. So the norms of international law and the thresholds, they do accept a certain level of conflict in cyberspace. But what's important is to attempt to increase the cost to the opponents and the consequences if they move beyond the actions, for instance, of espionage and crime. So to international law on these thresholds of cybercrime and espionage, traditionally when we think of crime and espionage, these are acts that are done by individuals. Espionage I'll put aside for a minute in terms of distinction between political espionage and economic espionage in cyber. But for state actions, when we talk about use of force in conflict in international law, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter is what's relevant. That's the provision of the Charter that prohibits all uses of force against a state's political independence and sovereign integrity. So a state in cyber conflict, and thinking about cyber attacks, must analyze what would amount to a use of force against its political independence and sovereign integrity. There's also another provision of the UN Charter which is very relevant in discussing conflict, and that's Article 51. That is one of the two exceptions built into the UN Charter of actually using force. So aside from Article 2.4, which prohibits it, there are two exceptions. One, if the Security Council authorizes it, of course, but also importantly under Article 51 if a state suffers an armed attack. So in the cyber domain, much has been discussed, and with the Tallinn Manual now out, it gives quite a lot for people to read these days and to discuss and debate as to what in the cyber domain would amount to an armed attack. Because states, in deciding whether they're actually going to use self-defense, they first must decide if they've suffered a use of force, and then they must decide if it's reached the threshold of an armed attack. So without getting into too much detail, I'm just going to throw out a couple of the sticky challenges under international law related to cyber security and the cyber domain and conflict. Here are the largest challenges that still exist. Concerns of violations of one's sovereignty is a difficult issue because traditionally violations of sovereignty and the norm of non-intervention falls below the Article 2.4 threshold of the UN Charter. So what does one do with respect to countermeasures if a state has suffered such a wrong? The issue under international law of what are acceptable countermeasures is critically important, and still yet a lot of research and not enough research has been done. Third-party sovereignty issues of innocent states that basically are pass-throughs and yet who suffer damages when two other states are engaging in conflict across their borders. The principle of state responsibility. When should a state be held responsible for cyber negative and adverse cyber activities that are maybe traverse their territory or are launched from their territory and do harm to others? What kind of legal responsibility and liability can we impose upon that state for not preventing it? And of course, economic espionage, which has been of much discussion in the last couple of years. The threat of cyber economic espionage, the reality of the IP theft that states like the US has suffered, have become key issues of international security, and as we've heard earlier, discussions between presidents. The difficulties with cyber with respect to, in comparison to other issues in international law, although it's not to say that international law could ever be irrelevant, because it is. It's more about how we go about applying it. But the challenges are certainly more complex. Enemies are more, the adversary and opponent is more invisible than traditionally. The damage can be delayed for quite a long time where you don't even know that within your system there's a logic bomb waiting to be triggered. Dual-use technology, as such in other areas, also challenges those that are looking to develop policy and rules around cyberspace. The actions of non-state actors who have become very powerful, just as in terrorism. And the time frame for the actual cyber incidents themselves being so quickly done where you might not have time to actually respond in self-defense. These are just a few of the challenges that we face when policymakers and lawyers try to analyze how the laws are to apply. One thing that I have been happy about in the last couple of years is the debate has moved. Originally, when I would start talking about the laws and the rules in which apply in cyberspace, I would often get a lot of pushback, and people would ask me to prove that they were applicable, right? To show them. Why would they believe me? Most of the debate has gone past that, and now there is a general international agreement that, yes, some of the laws do apply. Some of the international rules apply now. We are in this time frame where the more difficult work is being done and needs to be done. It is in the weeds, if you will, of just how those rules apply in cyberspace. But I am happy that from 16 years ago to now, that there is no longer this doubt whether they are applicable. Now we just must work together, and this is everybody, technologists, the academics, the practitioners, the business people, to find out just how we're going to take these rules that have existed for hundreds of years and apply them in this new environment, where, as I say under my principle number 1, states will continue to operate in this environment as they have operated in other domains. And therefore we must be prepared that we will see, and we have seen, not the cyber Pearl Harbor, but we will continue to see controversy and conflict in cyberspace, but we also will see the potential and hopefully the results of agreement, cooperation on some of the norms that will actually create the bounds for acceptable behavior. Thank you very much.